Just know that I'll always be right here.
Whoa. This is worthless.
What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and today we're talking about the whiplash that Games Workshop is giving me with their Warhammer Community 10th Edition articles. We're coming off the high of the Chaos Space Marine article, and some of maybe the most effective top-down design that 40k has ever seen, to this Necron article, which is very bad. Games Workshop has had a long and storied history of having literally no idea how to design the Necron faction. A faction based around survivability and regeneration doesn't work quite well in an army scale game like Warhammer 40k, where the goal of the game and the damage output of armies is based around eliminating your opponent from the table entirely. With a game as lethal as 40k is, the Necron ability to regenerate models and their focus on building units back up has never been able to be balanced effectively. Either it's too strong and Necron armies are impossible to kill, or it's not strong enough and either they focus entirely on non-infantry units, which is kind of against the theme of the army, or they're just terrible. And honestly, it doesn't feel like the trend has stopped, but that may be due to the quality of this article. So let's dive in and talk about the new mechanics for Necrons and exactly why this article is such a miss. First off, unlike the Chaos Space Marine article, we do have detachment and army rules for Necrons. So we do know the abilities that they're going to be getting both from being a Necron army and also being in the Awakened Dynasty detachment, which is likely to be the detachment that's available to them once the index releases. Reanimation Protocols returns as the Necron army rule. This allows your units to reanimate D3 wounds at the end of each of your command phases. Now the timing of this is a little bit odd. End of command phase is the same timing as primary objective scoring, which means that assuming that sequencing works like it does in 9th edition, you will be able to reanimate models before you move to scoring your primary objectives, meaning that you can put more objective control value of models on an objective to flip control of it, or even reanimate chain a little bit out in order to grab objectives that your unit was nearby but not actually touching or controlling. This is super powerful, and this has been one of the Necron's most impactful abilities in 9th edition 40k. Now the weirdness is that currently right now what we know about Battleshock tests is that they happen during the command phase, but we don't have a specific timing, and they most likely prevent your unit from controlling objectives entirely. So exactly when that Battleshop step occurs changes a lot how powerful this ability is. If it happens before it, which is what I assume given that Reanimation Protocols is specifically at the end, then you don't have the opportunity to reanimate units back into a unit to get it above its starting strength in order to ignore Battleshock tests. What most likely will be the case, though, is that you Battleshock first, then reanimate. Now, how does the Reanimation Protocols actually work? So you get D3 wounds back in the command phase. Each time one of those wounds reanimates, if you don't have any models with damage on them, or you have 1 wound models, then for each of those wounds you'll get a model back. Those models come back with 1 wound remaining, so if a model gets returned and you have more wounds to reanimate, then you'll just start healing that model, and if it heals back to full and you still have wounds remaining, then you'll reanimate another model. Obviously, you can only reanimate models that have been destroyed, so if the unit is back to its full starting strength, then it doesn't continue to get models back. It's likely that we'll have a lot of effects that trigger alongside reanimation protocols. Right now, just healing D3 wounds at the start of each turn doesn't feel like that impactful of an ability, but I assume that things like Cryptex and a lot of the characters, Resurrection Orbs and stuff like that, will be able to trigger this multiple times. We'll hopefully be able to trigger this out of phase, so you don't just have to do it at the start of your turn, and will also potentially benefit or buff the amount of models coming back. And we do see a couple of abilities like that spoiled currently. Now, the downside of this ability is that, very much like the Tyranid ability, the controlling player of the Necron army basically has no control over reanimation protocols. Not only do you have no control over how many models come back, you also don't have any control over whether or not your unit survives the turn. Fortunately, we don't have a situation like we did in 9th edition, where if you had large units of Necron warriors or immortals or something like that, and you got them down to a low number to then roll your reanimation protocols, there was a chance that they would run away and the unit would be destroyed before you had a chance to repair models to the unit with other abilities like Resurrection Orbs and Cryptex and stuff. That is no longer going to be the case, but you can have situations where the unit gets knocked down to a low number. You can reanimate models, but because they get battle shocked that turn, you're not actually that excited about it because they can't then take objectives back, which is really what you want them to be doing. We're also seeing factions like Space Marines that are able to target full rerolls onto things, and I think they're going to be supremely effective at removing large units from the table. And so you basically give your opponent control over whether or not they're going to let you trigger reanimation protocols. The hope, I think, is that the lethality of the game has reduced to a point that it's very difficult to one-shot units off the table. I don't know if we've seen enough profiles in the game and we've really had enough experience in the game to say whether or not that's the case. And certainly with some of the effects that we've been seeing from the other faction articles, it seems like some armies will be able to output a lot of damage. Maybe not 9th edition levels, but certainly a similar amount. And that definitely looks like enough to kill 20 Necron warriors in one go. Now let's talk about that detachment rule. This is from the Awakened Dynasty detachment and focuses on Necron characters, giving units that Necron characters join +1 to hit on all of their attacks, both ranged and melee. Another important thing, I think, is that we just talked a lot about Battle Shock, and characters will most likely have a pretty high leadership value compared to the units that they're joining. So Necron's reliance on not becoming battle shocked in order to sequence their reanimation protocols to steal or hold objectives is going to make it even more important for them to place characters in their units. So hopefully we'll see some character data sheets as we move on through the article.
That's called foreshadowing.
I also want to point out that the article mentions that characters will be useful to ensure that units remain above half strength. I think that they just mean that because the character is adding a model to the unit, it is then one model more difficult to bring them below half strength. Like, technically it's not wrong, but all right.
Technically correct. The best kind of correct.
So let's move on to talking about some data sheets. And the first one I want to talk about while we're on the subject of characters and reanimation protocols are Necron warriors. Now, part of the problem with revealing these data sheets, but not actually talking about points or the comparative value of units, is that it seems like Necron warriors are moving from being a relatively elite light-ish infantry to being, I think, what is intended to be played in a horde. It seems like Silvertide Necrons is supposed to be the name of the game for the faction moving on into 10th edition, but not giving us an actual value for these models makes it very difficult to determine how useful they're going to be. Necron warriors have had a significant downgrade from their 9th edition incarnation, losing both a weapon skill and ballistic skill, both their melee and ranged attacks going to hitting on 4s from hitting on 3s. You're very much meant to attach a character to the Necron warrior unit if you're trying to get value from their attacks. That's unfortunate because you are also benefiting from My Will Be Done and rerolls from units like the Silent King in the 9th edition codex, so Necron warriors are going from hitting on 2s to hitting on 3s, even when buffed with characters. Unless characters have some additional abilities to affect this. Gauss Flayers have lost their pip of AP, but instead gained the Lethal Hits ability, so instead of punching through armor a little bit better, they now essentially have the Disintegration Capacitor stratagem from the old codex baked in all the time. This is, I guess, kind of a side grade, but the fact that they only hit on a 4+ is a little bit unfortunate. Similarly, Gauss Reapers have also lost a point of AP, going from AP2 down to AP1. A lot of this can be chalked up to the generic reduction in AP that the entire game is undergoing, but it is still unfortunate for such an inaccurate weapon. Most interestingly, the Their Number is Legion ability sees a return on this datasheet, giving them a reanimation protocol roll of D6 instead of D3, and if they're on an objective marker, regenerating D3 plus 3 wounds instead. Similar to the Silvertide Necrons, however, the name of the game is removing this unit in its entirety to prevent reanimation protocols from triggering, so all of the reanimation synergies don't work. And depending on how easy that is to do, this ability is not that great. That said, going from regenerating D3 to D3 plus 3 models when you're holding an objective, especially with a pretty high OC value of 2, Necron warriors are going to be extremely good at holding down territory. Now, part of the problem of this unit is their terrible leadership value. One of the core components of the Necron faction identity for basically the entirety of their existence has been phenomenally strong leadership values, with an army-wide leadership of 10 across the entire faction in 9th edition. That has been reduced precipitously to leadership 7, with the new leadership characteristics valuing low numbers rather than high numbers. A leadership value of 7+ fails around 40% of the time, making this unit basically a coin flip once it's reduced to half strength that they'll be able to hold objectives at all. Now, I do want to caveat this with, again, that faction focus on attaching characters to the units. This feels like it's another incentive on top of that +1 to hit to put units like Necron Lords, Overlords, and Cryptex inside your Necron Warrior squads in order to shore up that leadership value. Since you're going to use the best leadership value of the unit, so the characters will almost assuredly have a superior leadership value. Now, I think I've been beating around the bush long enough here, but the spoiler is that there are no characters shown in this article. So for a faction that is based entirely around adding characters to the units to buff them and improve their survivability and ability to hold down objectives and territory, not showing any characters is absolutely flabbergasting. Now, we also don't see the other side of this datasheet, and it may be that, I don't know, maybe they're unit size increases, and the goal is to take big bricks of 30 Necron warriors to make it extremely difficult to remove the unit wholesale and extremely difficult to bring them below that half strength. But, I mean, again, none of this stuff is being showed, so we just literally have no idea. The other datasheet that was shown off is the monolith. And unlike the warrior unit, this one is definitely mostly a side grade from its current incarnation. It definitely feels like a revision of the datasheet rather than an update. In the past, the design team revealed that vehicles were going to get a wholesale increase in toughness value, and the Necron Monolith is one of the first vehicles that we've seen with this super high toughness value of 14. This is probably the equivalent of toughness 9 or so, maybe even 10 from 9th edition, where almost every medium rate anti-tank weapon in the game is gonna wound it on 5s, including things like las cannons and its own death rays from opposing monoliths. Super duper heavy anti-tank weapons, things like heavy laser destroyers, rupture cannons, and railguns that we've had spoiled previously in previous articles will still wound it on 3s, but those are going to be few and far between. And with their relatively variable damage values, getting through a 20 wound beast with a 2+ save that may be able to benefit from cover thanks to some of the terrain features is actually going to be relatively difficult to convert those wounds through. A 2+ save now is kind of the equivalent of a 4-ish plus invulnerable save, given that a lot of weapons have had their AP reduced. It's not super likely we see AP 4 very often, and even then, some terrain features are able to provide cover to vehicles, meaning that you're going to be saving on 4s or 5s. That said, the monolith did lose a couple of wounds, going down from its cap of 24 down to 20, but now has the new damaged mechanic. Instead of having a degrading profile where it loses movement, attacks, and ballistic skill, it is instead just going to get -1 to hit once it's down to 30% of its wounds characteristic, in this case 7. Now, one other thing I want to point out here is its similarly abysmal leadership value alongside the Necron warriors. It's coming in at that leadership 7 and will most likely not have the ability to have leaders join the unit in order to shore that up. And because vehicles and large units are now also susceptible to morale tests and battle shock once they're reduced to 50% of their starting strength, once this monolith is reduced to below 10 wounds, it's going to have to start checking on that leadership of 7. Failing a battle shock would be unfortunate though, because the monolith does have a very impressive objective control value of 8. And it is also extremely good at shoring up objectives thanks to its new Eternity Gate ability. Previously, this just pulled reinforcements out of strategic reserve and allowed them to reserve out of the monolith itself instead of coming off of a table edge, but now it gains the ability to set up units that are already on the battlefield. Alongside its own deep strike ability, and given the fact that the Eternity Gate triggers any time in your reinforcement step, it seems like you'll be able to deep strike the monolith somewhere on the table and then pull units from your own deployment zone to the front of the battle. This is another way that you can kind of play around the battle shock mechanic. Because movement phase happens after the command phase when you check for battle shock, you can actually see which of your units are going to be combat effective and cycle them in or out of combat with the monolith. I like this ability, and it gives some optionality to the monolith in addition to its just frankly impressive array of weaponry. Like I said before, a lot of the weapons on the monolith have been given mostly a side grade. A lot of their stats have been increased in some places and decreased in other places, and it's mostly been a tweak. The death rays, for example, have gone from their impressive D3+3 damage value to D6+1, which is mathematically around the same. The D3+3 is a little bit more consistent, averaging somewhere around 5-ish damage versus the 4.5 on D6+1, but obviously you can spike higher on a D6+1 damage weapon. It's also moved from strength 9 up to strength 12, although strength 9 was a little bit better in the comparison in 9th edition because it wounded basically every vehicle in the game on 3s, whereas strength 12 is going to hit heavily armored enemies on 4s, or even in the case of enemy monoliths on 5s. However, it does have a higher AP value, so that's kind of nice. Not only that, but it also has the sustained hits D3 attribute, meaning that every 6 to hit that it gets, it's going to get D3 additional hits at that D6+1 damage. And frankly, that has the potential to be huge. Unfortunately, this means that Necron Anti-Tank continues the trend of being ridiculously spiky, where a converted Death Ray attack has the possibility of doing between 2 and 28 damage. That's a pretty big difference. Hopefully there are ways to reroll or give you more opportunities to trigger that D3 sustained hits, and I think that would actually make the Death Ray monolith extremely effective, but if not, it's maybe a little bit spiky. That's in comparison to the Gauss Flux arc, which has gained an extra point of strength going from strength 5 to strength 6, which does make it better at clearing small infantry, especially toughness 3 infantry, and retains its strength characteristic against newly improved heavy infantry like Terminators or Gravis armor. That's all getting an additional toughness point. It has the rapid fire 3 ability, so going up to 6 shots at 12-inch range, but gains the lethal hit mechanic that now all Gauss weapons have. However, it has, like the other Gauss weapons, paid a point of AP for that. This does represent a reduction in its range, meaning that triggering that rapid fire is going to be that much more difficult than the current version. But with the ability to deep strike and probably a high incentive to deep strike the monolith, I think that you're probably going to be doing that. Maybe least is the particle whip on the top of the vehicle. This thing has gone from a single D6 blast weapon to instead 3 D6 shots, tripling its volume of attacks. However, the profile that it's shooting is much less impressive, going from strength 12 AP3 to strength 8 AP1. It does only have 2 damage rather than its previous 3, however, picks up the devastating wounds attribute, giving it mortal wounds on wound rolls of 6. This is a little bit of a confusing weapon since it's going to be kind of worthless against vehicles, wounding most of them on 5s and only being AP1, but it is very good at clearing even medium infantry. Things like intercessors and other T4 3+ save units are going to get vaporized by this weapon, and with both blast and the ability to trigger mortal wounds, even 1 wound infantry are going to be destroyed pretty quickly. It feels like the monolith is going to be largely an anti-infantry vehicle outside of the Death Ray composition, and to be honest, that's not really something that Necrons have ever really had trouble with. But we do have some spoilers for some anti-vehicle weapons elsewhere in the faction that you can use to synergize alongside this thing. Before I move on, I guess we should also mention that the Portal of Exile has had a significant change. It has lost a point of AP and also its auto-hitting effect. It is strength 8, but again, strength 8 less exciting against enemy vehicles. However, it trades that auto hit for hitting on 2s, which is, I don't know, kind of the same. Overall, a downgraded melee, which is unfortunate, because the monolith being good at clearing out random enemy units in melee was kind of part of its identity. So it being slightly worse at that is, again, actually pretty relevant. I should mention as well that this has the towering keyword, so it's going to be see and be seen through ruins, which is a pretty big deal. The monolith being able to target units that are hiding behind buildings is probably going to be pretty decent for it, although its range isn't huge, so it's probably not going to be alpha striking people off the table. However, it does regain the fly keyword, so hopefully it will be able to maneuver around those buildings a lot more easily than it did in 9th edition, which for some reason didn't fly, despite the fact that that's all monoliths do. They just float around. They're just big floating rocks. All right, speaking of those anti-vehicular weapons, let's get into that with the Doomsday Arc Doomsday Cannon. Now, one thing that I want to point out on both this and the monolith is that we don't yet know what Necron characters do. And previously, Necron characters with their Might Will have been absolutely crucial to buff vehicles and improve their ballistic skill. And I don't know if that is going to be retained. Hopefully, it's not just represented by their command protocols and they only buff the unit they're attached to. I hope that there is some sort of support for these vehicles that can make them a 2+ ballistic skill or give them rerolls. And I imagine that it's probably somewhere in there. We've already seen similar effects from things like the Orc mechanic, and it would be kind of weird if Technomancers didn't have a similar effect. That said, the Doomsday Cannon does come in at a D6 plus 1 attack, much better than the D6 that we had previously. It is based 3+ ballistic skill on those attacks, but comes in with the blast keyword, so it can potentially be generating some additional attacks against large units, and the heavy keyword, giving it a built-in +1 to hit if it doesn't move. And the Doomsday Arc has always had this sub-theme of not wanting to move because its attacks generally became horribly worthless when it didn't move. Fortunately now, it just gets big benefits when it stands still, but its attacks aren't like super nerfed. It is strength 15, so it's going to be wounding basically all vehicles in the game on 3s, including opposing monoliths, and punch through their armor at AP4 with a flat 4 damage. While its AP has been reduced slightly, going from AP5 down to AP4, that's to be expected with the overall reduction in AP in the game, but otherwise its profile is significantly better. Its strength is much higher, will be wounding the same against most vehicles, and is much better against lighter units, and its base damage characteristic of 4 is a lot better than its previous version of d6, with a higher volume of attacks to boot. On top of that, if it stands still, it also benefits from the overwhelming obliteration attribute, which grants it the devastating wounds ability, giving it the ability to convert that damage into mortal wounds. This can actually make it very good at clearing infantry if it is able to stand still, because every one of those devastating wounds is going to kill 4 1-wounders or 2 2-wound models with the converted mortal wounds, or just punch through invulnerable saves and other defensive mechanics that the target might have. The Doomsday Cannon definitely seems like a strict upgrade, but the hope is that there is also going to be some army support for it, so it's not required to stand still in order to get any sort of reliability out of its ballistic skill. The other weapon that we've been shown is the Spear of the Void Dragon, the weapon of the Catan Shard of the same name. It's going to be interesting to see how Catan Shards operate in the new incarnation of the game, because their abilities were kind of akin to psychic powers. So it's likely that we see Catan abilities be converted into normal attacks or abilities that are listed on their datasheet, just like we've seen with psychic powers from the Librarian or Swarmlord or any of the other Psychers that have been spoiled so far. That said, the only thing that we have here is the actual weapon characteristic of the Void Dragon. He's able to make both sweep and strike melee attacks, a little bit different than previously where he only had the sweep profile. He also had a ranged profile, which we don't know if it exists on his datasheet, literally only getting the melee weapons here. His strike profile is very good at clearing vehicles. It is 5 attacks that are hitting on 2s. They are strength 12, but that shouldn't matter too often. Only AP 3, which is a little bit of a downgrade from its previous version of AP 4. However, D6 plus 2 damage. In the past, the weapon was damage D6 and got up to D3 plus 3 against vehicles, but having a flat D6 plus 2 against everything is definitely an upgrade. The benefit against vehicles that it has now is the anti-vehicle 2+ ability, giving it critical wounds on a 2+. So it's going to hit on 2s, wound on 2s for D6 plus 3. As long as you don't save it, this thing is going to absolutely spear right through you. The downside is that AP value of 3. Most vehicles are going to be saving on 5s or 6s, so with a low attack volume, there is certainly the chance that your opponent spikes out of getting absolutely skewered by this big stick. It is also pretty useful against infantry with its sweep profile, now able to make 10 attacks. Unfortunately, imposing a -1 to hit on itself, now hitting on a 3+. However, at strength 8, AP 1, 2 damage, it's good at killing both single wound enemies and more heavy medium infantry like Space Marines. A little bit hard to judge the Void Dragon entirely just based on his weapon profile. Mostly the Void Dragon was kind of a close range shooting attacker, being able to launch Catan powers and throw his spear in the shooting phase. We don't know if those abilities will carry over, so not too much to talk about. Now, the one last thing before the end of the article here is a stratagem that was spoiled, and it follows the same trend that we've been seeing in other factions, where stratagems have an effect, but then an enhanced effect if you use them in specific situations. In this case, we see the protocol of the Hungry Void, which is a reinterpretation of the command protocols from the 9th edition codex. This gives you +1 strength in melee, basically exactly the benefit of the disruption field stratagem that we've had in the previous codex. However, if you have a character in your unit, you improve the armor penetration characteristic of your melee weapons by 1. This seems pretty good, but overall, a very underwhelming stratagem to display. I hope this isn't the best stratagem in the codex, because while it's certainly useful and in some situations can give you +1 to hit and +1 AP against a particular enemy profile, it does kind of require some high base strength values in order to matter. Hopefully we see things like Scorpic Destroyers at like strength 9 or 10, so that +1 strength can now wound a large category of vehicles on 3s, and the +1 AP can punch through their armor and actually clear them very effectively. I do really like this mechanic where stratagems are more effective when you are using them in concert with the faction abilities, but we just don't know what Necron leader units do. Are there going to be a lot of characters in a Necron army? It's definitely pointing towards that, but we don't know what they do, we don't know what other buffs they have, and we don't know how cheap they are. If Necron characters are like 20 points and you can put Cryptex in every single unit, this faction's actually going to be pretty okay. But if Necron characters are as expensive as they are right now, and similarly kind of worthless, then this is terrible. And it really highlights the problem with these articles so far. The most interesting articles have been the Space Marine and Chaos Space Marine ones, where they show off a powerful faction ability, then also show off some other abilities elsewhere in the faction that interact with that in an interesting way. Abaddon regenerating CP based on his usage of the Dark Pact mechanic is super sick. Why do they show off the Necron Warrior datasheet without showing off an Overlord with a Resurrection Orb, so we can actually get a full picture of how these mechanics are supposed to interact with each other? Let me know down in the comments comment section what you think about this, but overall, this is an absolute travesty of a hype article. There's no way it makes anyone excited about Necrons in 10th edition. Looking forward to the indexes for these, but man, these articles are sending me every which way. Thanks for watching all the way to the end of the video. Big thanks as well to everybody who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. I love you all. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.